Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk about Gandhi's essay, The Practice of Satyagraha. It's a really moving essay about the practice of nonviolence and kind of the reason why one can and should be nonviolent. Obviously, Gandhi wasn't perfect, but I think his theory of nonviolence can still be very useful, and it was extremely impactful for the social movement for decolonization in India, but also future social movements such as the civil rights movement in the U.S. So Gandhi was obviously a nonviolent activist, revolutionary. He was a practicing lawyer, and so what ended up happening was that he at first thought that colonization, Western colonization, was a good thing with respect to education and culture. But then when he was a practicing lawyer in South Africa, which was another country colonized by the British, he had some really bad experiences, and those experiences led him to realize, colonization is actually not really good. And so one of those experiences was when he was on a train and he wasn't allowed to sit in the front because he wasn't white. And so they kicked him off the train. And so that kind of led him to start practicing and thinking about acts of civil disobedience. So it started in South Africa, and then he brought it to India in the case of India being also colonized by the British. And so the philosophy of nonviolent resistance is founded upon these metaphysical principles about how reality exists that are rooted in Hinduism and Jainism. And so both of these philosophies hold that all sentient beings are deserving of compassion and kindness. Sentient meaning capable of experiencing pain and pleasure. So not just humans, but non-human animals, and also just having a respect for all living things is important. So the title, The Practice of Satyagraha is referring to this insistence upon the truth, the morally correct, right truth. And then the Satyagrahi is someone who is a truth seeker. They are a practitioner of nonviolence. They are the person who's acting and embodying this nonviolence. And at the root of nonviolent resistance is what's referred to as ahimsa. So ahimsa is basically compassion. It's no ill will. So it's not feeling anger. It's not feeling frustration. It's trying to eliminate that anger from within, and that way we can translate it to our speech and to our actions. And so this ahimsa, this lack of ill will, translates to all non-human animals and forms of life itself. So the fundamental purpose of nonviolence, especially when we're thinking about it in terms of an oppressed oppressor situation, is that individuals who are oppressed, right, how do they respond to oppression, especially in cases where they have less power, they maybe don't even have a military, or they're just not viewed as being fully human, right? This has happened historically. And so the purpose of nonviolence then is to enable us to and cultivate this compassion for all beings, even the oppressor, which is really hard. So I think it's really easy to have compassion for people you love or for innocent people, but someone who's oppressing you, right, really, really hard. But that's kind of at the root of it, because we're supposed to, we as in the individuals practicing nonviolence, we're supposed to thwart and shock the oppressor through responding to their violence with nonviolence. So it's meant to kind of baffle them and think, why are they acting nonviolently? And maybe have them rethink what they're doing and why they're doing it. So Satyagraha does not equal passivity or inaction. Gandhi is very intense about making that distinction. He's saying, no, you're still acting. It's just a controlled use of the will that's not channeled violently in a way that we're kind of told that is natural for us. Gandhi believes that nonviolence is actually a natural way of existing, but we've been so confused and missocialized that we think it's really hard to be nonviolent, when in fact it actually is more natural for us to be nonviolent. So what is passive resistance? How does it differ from nonviolence? Passive resistance, Gandhi says, is a weapon of the weak, which sometimes allows for the use of violence, whereas nonviolence, as he says, is a weapon of the strong, which never allows for the use of violence. So you're still, doing things, but you're not doing it in a violent way. And when he talks about strength, right, he's talking about it in terms of mental, spiritual, intellectual strength, right? We're not talking about physical strength here, right? That has nothing to do with this. We're talking about being able to be self-disciplined and control the will. So in order to be a satyagraha, right, one is engaging in acts of civil disobedience and civil resistance. So for example, boycotting British goods, so that way one is not reliant upon the British economy, getting one's own salt, again, not relying on the British economy. There have been so many other, examples of civil resistance and civil disobedience with, for example, refusing to get off of the back of the front of the bus, or refusing to get off of the bus in general with respect to segregation, not necessarily allowing for structures of power to dominate you, even if you end up getting physically hurt. So that's part of the reason why nonviolent resistance is really difficult. But Gandhi is very clear to say that this is civil resistance. It's not criminal. He says that someone who's acting in a criminal way, right, they are breaking the law and they're trying to avoid the penalty. They're not really doing it for a principled reason. Whereas a civil resistor is following the law because they consider the law good for the welfare of society. But sometimes they do break the law if they believe that the law is unjust, if it's bad for any portion of the population. So therefore, they are openly and civilly disobeying the law, but they're not trying to escape the penalty. They're willing to experience the penalty because they're trying to make a statement. But of course, these acts of non-cooperation are really tests of our sincerity, because we have to really be dedicated to it, because it is so hard, because we might lose whatever it is we have, even if it is a little. And it's a lot easier to say that, oh, I believe in nonviolence, without actually practicing it, right? So it's nonviolence is where our ideas are supposed to be translated into our actions. But the strength of the Satyagrahi, the strength of the non-cooperationists, comes from the correctness and truth of their position, knowing that they are on the right side rather than the immoral side or the unethical side. And so they're setting an example for other people through their humbleness, through their humility, through their self-restraint. Because if you see other people acting nonviolently, then you might be more likely to be nonviolent, right? It's kind of that chain reaction. So nonviolence then requires one to really be fully committed to it. So not partially or on the fence about it, right? But to really feel confident in what one is doing and to believe it with all of one's heart, as Gandhi says. And he says many people who are religious, should be able to embrace nonviolence, because it's the creed of many religions. Nonviolence is a creed of many religions. Unfortunately, though, violence has been used as an excuse through these various religions. But he says that that's actually not what these religious texts are teaching. He says he's studied all of these different religions, and no religion has said you must be violent, right? He says nonviolence is actually obligatory in some religions, whereas violence has been permissible in some cases. And so this is where he gets into the metaphysics of nonviolence, the reality of how nonviolence works, where he talks about how, he says, I've looked at the Quran, I've looked at the Mahabharata in Hinduism, and he says that violence has not triumphed at all. So what's actually triumphed has been a mutual regard and love for the other person or the situation, right? That is what has won in these religious texts. And then he talks about how nature itself is founded upon attraction, right? It's based off of attraction. It's based off of love. And it's love that enables nature to exist and persist. We don't live by destruction. Otherwise, we wouldn't exist, right? And think about situations where we have been destructive towards one another, right? It's been terrible. And then he also talks about the important and interesting idea of self-love, where we have self-love, but it doesn't end just with the self. It leads to the love for others. So it's not just contained within the self, but we are able to apply that love that we have for ourselves to other people. And then he kind of goes back to how nonviolence can work in India. And he says that when it comes to the struggle against colonialism, violence hasn't been working. So we need to try something else. But nonviolence is not solely a policy or a tactic. It's a way of existing. We have to be able to cultivate nonviolence within ourselves when it comes to the people we interact with on a daily basis, and also when it comes to our political action as political agents. Oftentimes, nonviolence is more difficult, though, because you can get hurt, and the long-term consequence or the short-term effects can be much more difficult. But nonviolence is meant to have deeper and longer effects than using violence, because he talks about how power attained by violence in order to end violence, right, isn't truly changing things. He says that it just perpetuates a cycle of violence. And I think that refers to kind of the famous moral dilemma of, must we use the oppressor's tools to dismantle the oppressor's house, right? Should we use the communication of the oppressor in order to change what's happening, or should we be transformative and use something that is much more difficult but will have longer lasting results? So, in order to be nonviolent, then we have to not be angry with the person or people involved. We can't engage in physical or verbal abuse. We have to really embody this complete innocence. So, not having any ill will towards all beings. That includes other animals, that includes the oppressor, because that will truly change things. So, this is why nonviolence requires all of our full effort, but at the same time, he's responding to the idea that violence begets more violence. And so, in order to really change things, in order to have a transformative kind of revolution, or in order for there to be a change of power, we have to really embrace nonviolence.